So most people, if they think of a community garden as a nice place to grow tomatoes or cucumbers or whatnot, but your team spent many years or a few years studying urban gardens across California, and you found how genuine biodiversity hotspots with over 50 species of bees, ladybugs, parasitoids, a lot of that life. If a 14-year-old asked you why a half-acre garden in a city matters ecologically, what would you tell them?
So I would tell them that urbanization or like the concrete jungle is one of the leading causes of biodiversity declines, but that urban gardens provide a kind of refuge or a kind of oasis within the city that have all sorts of green vegetation, that have all kinds of flowers, ornamental plants, crops, and just a bunch of resources that biodiversity can use. And so, like you mentioned, we've documented a huge number of species of bees, of ladybugs, of parasitoids, spiders, ants, birds, plants, all different kinds of things that can thrive within community gardens. And so that plays a really important role in supporting biodiversity within the city and also in terms of providing kind of connections to other green spaces. So there are other kinds of green habitats within cities like forests, surprisingly cemeteries, and streets that have a lot of trees. And so if you have more green habitats like gardens, then biodiversity might be able to jump from one place to another in order to have more resources across the entire city.
Yeah, so I was reading some of your PhD research was in Chiapas, Mexico, studying ants
Mhm.
and shade-grown coffee. So you found that Azteca ants on shade coffee trees make coffee cherries significantly heavier when ants and pollinators were both present, but only under high shade and biodiverse conditions. What was it about that particular finding that really shaped how you think about biodiversity and food production?
Oh gosh, that's such a it was such a interesting study and an unexpected result because most people don't think that ants play an important role in, let me rephrase, most people don't think that ants play a beneficial role in pollination. It's more the conventional wisdom that ants might chase away pollinators and therefore they're not actually being able to pollinate plants. But in this case, we saw that it wasn't even the pollination success, but it was actually the size of the fruits. And so we were super puzzled as like, why could that happen? And what would be the mechanism driving that? Years later, we did another study looking at floral microbes. So these are like yeasts and bacteria that actually live in the nectar inside flowers. And we found that the presence of ants had a really big impact on those yeasts and those bacterias in the flower nectar. And so that's one possible mechanism that we later could link to those findings to say maybe it's the way that ants are influencing the floral microbes and that could influence the growth of the flowers later on.
Yeah, so I want to explore a little bit more about the ants. So they're a little
Mhm.
complicated how they protect coffee from herbivores, which is good. They also tend scale insects, which are pests. So is that
Mhm.
kind of the same organism as both helpful and harmful dynamic something in these urban gardens as well?
Yes and no. We haven't really collected any evidence to talk about that in garden systems. Sorry, my phone is ringing and I have to stop that so I can hear. Okay. So yeah, so we haven't really documented that in urban garden systems. Like we haven't collected data on that, but it is very likely to be happening because that mutualism between ants and scale insects or between ants and aphids is very common in a lot of different agricultural systems. And it's something that scientists have repeatedly found that like most farmers don't like ants because that's what they see is that the ants are tending scale insects or tending the aphids. But really, when we do collect the data, like in coffee systems, and I've also seen some evidence from olive farms that the even though the ants are tending the scale insects, that they have an overall beneficial effect on the crop because they're removing the other bigger, nastier herbivores. So in the garden system, like we haven't really looked for it, but based on what we know from other ecological systems, it's likely that it's also happening there.
Yeah, so your 2023 ecology letters, you looked at all those gardens and found that they positively affect biodiversity, food production, and human well-being. That really goes against the assumption that growing food costs you biodiversity. So why are urban gardens different in that particular regard?
I don't necessarily think the gardens are different. I just think that people assume that there's a negative relationship between biodiversity and well-being or between biodiversity and yield without always collecting the data. So when we actually looked at that and had the data to show that biodiversity was positively correlated with all of these different metrics of human well-being, that it was surprising, but it also wasn't that surprising because we had the actual information to back it up.
Yeah, so you also found that at peak harvest, gardeners produce about 4 pounds of food per week. That's saving a lot of, I think, roughly $16 against these kind of local organic prices. But the people who need food most, low income gardeners with larger families, aren't the ones producing the most. So what's driving that gap?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that I think I need to think a little bit more about. There's all sorts of equity gaps in terms of who has time to garden. I think lower income residents are likely going to be working longer hours or have multiple jobs. It's also correlated with having more children. And so low income gardeners might have less time to be able to dedicate to their garden. And so that might be one reason why they're producing less food. But I think there's also more of a societal responsibility that a lot of the gardens have more resources, like the gardens that have more resources, more access to compost, more access to mulch, more access to seedlings, and that kind of help tend to be in the higher income neighborhoods. So it's who society is helping more might be the people that already have means and already have their own capability of doing that kind of work. So I think it's both like the time and the resources that are provided by government institutions or by nonprofits that are running the garden.
Yeah, so one of the most biodiverse gardens you studied was the Beach Flats Community Garden in Santa Cruz,
Mhm.
which is half an acre in one of the poorest neighborhoods near the boardwalk. So a lot of
Mhm.
species of bees, ladybugs, in a place where a lot of people really wouldn't think about or think to look. So what made that garden so interesting and rich?
I think that this garden is particularly interesting. Is a garden that literally used to be a garbage, like the space used to be a garbage dump and a place where people would pick up prostitutes in this low income neighborhood. And a group of residents decided to turn it into a garden to try and turn around the space. And so there's a long history in that garden of trying to bring in a lot of different people to bring not only crops, but also a lot of ornamental plants, a lot of trees. I think another reason that it becomes very biodiverse is because that neighborhood is almost entirely concrete. So, going back to your very first question of why urban gardens are so important for biodiversity, I think that this garden in particular, because it is almost completely surrounded by concrete, like this is the only refuge in that neighborhood. Whereas if you're in a neighborhood that has a lot of green space, or people have a lot of front yards, or there's gardens in people's backyards, or there's city parks, there's a lot of places where the biodiversity can spread out. But since in beach flats, this is the only green space possible, all of the biodiversity has to cluster in that area to find resources. So there might be a concentration of biodiversity in that particular garden.
Yeah, so you published a paper showing that land tenure security, whether gardeners feel confident their plot won't be taken away, it really changes what they plant and how diverse the garden becomes. Why does that sense of security really matter so much for what is growing in these gardens?
I think it matters because if you think, oh, I might be here next year, then you might be more willing to plant a tree that might take a few years before it produces fruit, or you might be more likely to plant a perennial plant that might survive for a longer time, or you might be more likely to invest in building up the soil health by adding compost or by planting cover crops. So I think all of those things mentally provide gardeners with more security and then a stronger willingness in order to plant more things or invest in longer lived plants. Whereas if you just think you're going to be there for the next 2 months and then that's it, okay, great. I'm just going to plant some things that I can harvest over the next 2 months, but you don't have that same incentive to plant things that might live for a long time.
Yeah, so if a teenager or a family wanted to set up a small garden that actually supports pollinators and pest control and not just grows food, what would you tell them to do differently from a normal garden? And what does that kind of good management actually look like?
It's a normal garden. I think that's it's a really good question. I think I would definitely suggest to people to put different types of plants that flower at different times, that have different kinds of flowers, thinking about different colors or different shapes or different sizes of flowers, some things that flower early in the season, some things that flower late in the season. I would suggest putting both crops and ornamentals, and maybe this is a little unconventional, but leaving a little bit of the weeds in the gardens because we found that different groups of pollinators tend to use different types of plants, with flies actually visiting crop flowers more often, bees visiting ornamental flowers more often, and butterflies actually visiting weed flowers more often. And so that having the different types of plants in your garden might actually support a more thriving pollinator community. And the last thing that I usually recommend is like not using too much mulch or wood chips in the garden because that can really contribute to ground nesting bees not being able to find habitat for making their nests. But at the same time, like mulch can be really beneficial for other things like improving water content in the soil and improving the carbon and the soil health. So don't completely eliminate your use of mulch, just don't put it everywhere.
Yeah, on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most urgent, how important is it that cities protect and expand community gardens right now?
I would definitely give it a 5. I am a little biased because that's what I study and what I spend a lot of my time doing. But I think that we saw during the COVID pandemic how critical local sources of food were. And we saw with the disruption of supply chains how vulnerable our food system is. And urban community gardens play a really important role in having a local place where people can go to grow food and harvest food. I think it's also really critically important for biodiversity conservation, as we've already been talking about, but I think also just for the physical and mental health of the gardeners. It's really important having a place to recreate, having a place to make friends, having a place to do exercise that's outdoors is really important for the gardeners that I have interacted with.
Yeah, so for a teenager, say a teenager who doesn't have a garden, what's one thing that they could do this week to start seeing insects and ecology in their own neighborhood?
Just sit outside for 10 minutes in any patch of world that has a flower or has a plant, and you're likely to see something there. Even in I literally have gone into parking lots to count the number of flowers that I find in like the Trader Joe's parking lot, and there's life there. There are things that are happening that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate. And so I think just like spending the time to sit and observe and watch what's happening, and you'll definitely discover something new.
Yeah, so who are a few scientists that I should interview next? They can be agroecologists, urban ecologists, whatever.
Ooh, scientist you should interview next. I think if you haven't talked already to Shalini Jha, her name is spelled ShaleneJha is the last name. She's a professor at the University of Texas, and she's done a lot of work looking at pollinator conservation genetics. I've worked with Shalini for a long time. Other scientists, I don't know, you might reach out to Claire Kremen, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia, who has done a lot of work in conservation biology, both in like natural habitats and in agricultural habitats.
Yeah, I'll send you a follow-up email probably later today,
Yeah,
maybe tomorrow. And I have one more question. I really like asking
yeah.
this question. You can answer however you'd like. I've gotten a lot of different responses, and it's if you have one sentence to say to the next generation, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, one sentence for the next generation. I don't know. It sounds very cliche, but it's up to you to figure out what's going to happen with the world. By the time people get to be my age, they get jaded and I don't know what we can accomplish anymore. So it's like the enthusiasm of the young people is really important and that you have the power to do whatever you think is best.